Again, my name is Andy Salis. I am the Humane Educator for DuPage County Animal Services. And this evening, I'm going to be talking about our wild neighbors. So we'll talk a bit about the common wildlife you should expect to see in your backyard and in your neighborhood, issues that they may have that would require our assistance, and then also resources for each of you if you are having a problem with a wild animal and need some help resolving the issue in a humane way. So let's go ahead and get started. So tonight, of course, is all about living with wildlife. And at DuPage County Animal Services, we really try hard to promote a humane world. And when it comes to human-wildlife interactions, we fully support the tenets created by the Humane Society of the United States. So that will include respect for the environment, tolerance and understanding of living things, and an intent to resolve conflict via non-lethal means. So that's always our primary goal. We want to make sure that we're respecting the animals that really were here long before we were, and understanding that they have a need to use this land just the same way that we do. To try to tolerate and understand them and work together copacetically rather than always being at odds. And then if conflict does arise, we always like to try non-lethal means to resolve said conflict first before we have to resort to anything more extreme. So that will be what we focus on for today. Now, to get us started, we're really going to look at the wildlife that we would expect to encounter on a pretty regular basis in this area. So we'll address when to worry. So when you might find an animal that's in need of your help or professional help, how to prevent negative interactions, and we'll close with who to call for help. So I'll provide you with several options for professional resources that can be of aid if you do encounter a wild animal that needs assistance beyond what you're capable of offering, or if you are having a negative conflict that you just don't know how to resolve. We'll talk about some professional resources that are out there and available to you. So let's go ahead and get started by reviewing our usual suspects. So this will not encompass all of the wild animals that you may encounter in this area, but I tried to pick the animals that we at DuPage County Animal Services get the most calls about. So hopefully by doing this, I'll be addressing any questions or concerns that you have with wildlife in your area. And if not, again, at the end, definitely feel free to shoot me a question and I will do my best to answer it for you. So let's go ahead and get started with deer. So deer are probably one of our most easily recognized animals, not just in this country, but just across the world. They're one of the most readily identified wild animals. Once a very elusive species that was actually hard to find, deer have actually become very well adapted to human environments. Now, in North America, we have several varieties of deer. Most commonly are mule, blacktail, and whitetail. And in this immediate area, most likely what you'll encounter are white-tailed deer. Now, when we talk about deer and potential conflicts with humans, usually it's surrounding destruction of yards and gardens. So when you have deer in your garden, you'll be able to tell. You'll see plants like you see pictured here on the slide. There will be a lot of uneven cropping of leaves. So they'll take a little nibble here and a little nibble here. But ultimately, you'll see some fairly significant destruction if you've had a deer visitor in your yard. They tend to heavily favor fertilized ornamental and garden plants. So if you are seeing some garden destruction due to deer, make sure you're being mindful of the fertilizer that you're using, and if possible, try to avoid any purchased fertilizers. You can certainly compost and use that to create nutrient-rich soil, but commercial fertilizers, for whatever reason, seem to really attract deer to gardens. And they really are going to enjoy a lot of those garden plants that we are planting to feed ourselves. So any vegetable gardens, things like that, are going to fall prey to deer. And they do seem to have a preference for some of our ornamental plants as well. Lilies being one of them. So they seem very oddly drawn to them, and they will preferentially eat them when they're available. You'll be able to tell that you do in fact have deer in your yard and maybe not just a really voracious rabbit if you look for browse lines. So you will find that deer ideally like to stay near a tree line. So especially if you've got gardens planted near a tree line, you'll find an almost straight line of destruction because they like to stay near perceived cover and safety. Sometimes you'll find that along the line of your house as well. So if they feel like they are being granted a visual barrier and subsequent protection from your house, they'll graze right along the side of it as well. But you'll see a pretty uniform straight line, and that's a dead giveaway that you've got deer in your yard tearing up your garden. We also have a potential for run-ins during rut season. So that typically runs from October to January, sometimes starting a little later and going on a little further into the subsequent year, depending on weather. But this will be the time of the year when male deer are out and about, showing off and trying to find a girlfriend. And so we do see some human conflicts when people stumble across males in rut. The males are just feeling a little bit more frisky, a little bit more territorial, and they're likely to strike out in a negative manner, more likely in this time frame than they would any other time of the year. So when we look at deer, there will be some circumstances in which they're going to need our assistance. So if you find deer that are the victim of a road traffic accident and still alive, they will need immediate attention. And that is definitely a 911 situation. So we will be talking about who to call for help later on. But if you see a deer or honestly any wild animal that is a victim of a run-in with an automobile, you definitely want to call the police as quickly as possible because they'll be able to get there faster than any other service, and they can offer humane euthanasia if the animal is not savable. Any deer that will allow you to openly approach it is likely sick and does require some level of attention. While not necessarily as emergent as a traffic accident, this is definitely a deer that's going to need some assistance. If deer have any damaged limbs or obvious open bleeding wounds, they will likely need professional care. If you encounter a fawn that is placed in a location that puts them in danger from dogs and heavy machinery, we see this quite a bit in more open country. So if we're out in farmlands, there's definitely times when fawns wander into areas where they might be right in the way of a tractor or a combine. So whenever we see fawns in those situations, we definitely want to address that and try to offer them assistance when we can. And of course, deer will definitely need our help if they are found to be trapped or caught, especially in a fence like I have pictured here. I know it's very sad to look at, but that's probably the most common deer-related call that we get at DuPage County Animal Services, especially with those youngsters that are really getting their legs underneath them. They're far more confident in their jumping ability than they should be, and they often get themselves hung up on fences. So if you encounter a deer like this, we'll definitely talk about who you reach out to, but you do want to contact a professional immediately to assist. But I will caution, please do not cut that deer free and release it until it's been fully assessed. So that's for your safety and for the deer's as well. So the deer will definitely feel trapped, they're in pain, they're frightened, they're likely to lash out, and deer can cause a significant amount of damage. So you definitely want to stay clear, but we also don't want to let the deer down until we've been able to assess their injuries. Because they're so pumped up on adrenaline at this point, if we let them down and they were suffering from an extreme injury, such as a broken leg, it's actually highly likely that they'll be able to bound away quicker than we can capture them to give them the assistance that they need, just because they're so pumped up on adrenaline. So we definitely want to make sure that if they're caught, they stay that way until professionals are there and prepared to offer them help. You may also encounter deer that are unresponsive or unconscious. This is usually the result of an injury that was received earlier, that the deer, again, had enough adrenaline to get away and then collapses. Some cases of extreme infections can cause this as well. So if you find a deer breathing but unconscious, you're definitely going to want to seek professional help. Now, I think probably the second most common call that we get regarding deer at DuPage County is reports of abandoned fawns. So I always like to clarify with everyone that fawns are very rarely abandoned. Does will often leave their fawns alone for entire days and sometimes up to 2 days at a time. So mom will hide her offspring typically in deep foliage. So if you've got an area with high grass or a lot of shrubbery, you'll usually find mom hiding a fawn in that area. So she can go off and forage, and she will travel a great distance from that hiding spot because she's trying to draw predators away from her offspring. Now, ideally, that fawn stays exactly where mom put him or her, but just like human toddlers, they don't always hold still the way we'd like them to. So that fawn may wander out and drift around the yard, toddle about a little bit. All of that is okay. Mom will be able to track them down by scent and find them when she's ready. So you want to make sure that if you are seeing a fawn without a mom present, that you're giving it at least a full 48 hours before becoming concerned and calling for professional help. And of course, during this time, we want to leave that fawn alone as much as possible. We don't want that fawn acclimating to humans, and we certainly don't want to startle them and cause them to wander further away, which might make it difficult for mom to locate them when she returns. Now, our next common suspect when we talk about wildlife in this area are our rabbits, and that's going to be predominantly eastern cottontails. They are extraordinarily abundant across almost the entirety of the United States, and they are especially abundant in northern Illinois. Right now, they're actually at the tail end of their breeding season. They have another month or so where they'll still be breeding and having litters. And females can actually have litters of up to 8 at a time. So if you've encountered a bunny nest, it's highly likely that you'll have quite a few juveniles bouncing around in the yard, either already or very shortly as they begin to explore their own freedom and get out and look at the world. Now, potential conflicts with rabbits are almost universally with our household gardens. So rabbits, like deer, are voracious eaters, and they will get into pretty much any garden plant. And of course, they can cause issues with digging under fences and sheds, and that can pose a problem. We do also see issues with rabbit and pet encounters. So typically our dogs get out and stumble across a nest, and we see some conflict there, more with our dogs getting into something that we don't want them to. So it's definitely a good idea. I know I personally do this in the spring and early summer. At least once a day, once every other day, I'll take a stroll around my yard and see if I see any evidence of a rabbit's nest. So you're looking for a bunch of piled up dead grass, tufts of fur. That's usually an indicator that there's either a nest right there or nearby. And if I see those signs, I'm really vigilant to make sure there aren't any baby bunnies in my yard before I turn my dogs out. And if there are, I have used snow fencing to encircle that area to keep my dogs out, or I've even done things like put a laundry hamper over the nest just when my dogs are out in that area to make sure that they're not causing any harm and disturbing that nest. And then once they're back inside, I just lift the laundry basket up again. Now, a big issue that we see with rabbits isn't necessarily a conflict that we have with them, but rather a conflict that they likely have with us, and that is bunny napping. So we frequently get calls about abandoned nests of rabbits, just like we do with abandoned fawns. And this is actually a very common occurrence at Willowbrook Wildlife Center as well. They get a lot of juvenile and infant rabbits brought to their facility that actually didn't need assistance. So I like to go through when it's appropriate to rescue a baby bunny and when we should really be leaving them alone. And generally speaking, unless the bunnies meet certain standards, and we'll discuss those here in a moment, it is best to not intervene if you see infant rabbits. Baby bunnies are not easy to rehabilitate. And in fact, even with expert professional care, most of them do not make it into adulthood if they have been taken away from their mother. So just like with deer, mother rabbits will leave their young and only visit maybe once or twice a day. And that's typically going to be at dawn and dusk. Again, just like with deer, that mother rabbit does not want to draw predators into that area where it might be putting her offspring at risk of harm. So you may never see the mom come and go. So we definitely get calls where folks are watching the nest and they say they never see mom. Mom is likely very close by, but she's not going to make herself known if there's a predator, i.e. us, in that area. So you definitely want to avoid hovering if you've noticed a nest, and give mom an opportunity to come care for her young. And if the young are fully furred and have their eyes open and roughly about the size of a softball, they don't need their mom anymore. So they're still going to look very young and they're still going to look like they should need nurturing, but they do not. So if they've got all their fur, their eyes are open, and they're approximately softball sized, regardless of whether you've noted mom in the area or not, they are just fine. Now, if you are unsure if mom is visiting, there are a couple of tricks that you can use. So you can take just a piece of string or thread and place it over the top of the nest, and you can note the next day if it's been disturbed. Or one of my favorite tricks is to actually just take a bag of flour and I will pour a little flour ring around the nest, and I'll see if any of that flour has been kicked up the next day when I wake up and go out into the yard. That'll give me a good idea of whether or not mom has been in the area recently. Now, again, ideally, we want to leave our rabbits in the wild, but there are going to be some circumstances where they need our help. And this really will apply to both adults and young rabbits. So if you see an obvious open wound, one that is deeper than just a scratch, so we're talking about large open wounds that are actively bleeding or look infected. If you see unidentified bleeding that is copious enough for you to notice from a distance. If a rabbit has an obviously broken bone, we do see that fairly frequently. Rabbits are highly desired prey items for our large raptors in the area. And sometimes the rabbits are picked up and then dropped if the raptor had a bad grip or was startled. So we do see a fair number of bunnies that have experienced broken limbs as a result. Typically, this is going to relate to our young infant rabbit. really never seen one that a raccoon cannot get into if they really want to. They also love to break into attics, basements, and crawl spaces. So we will talk about preventative measures later on, but home maintenance is definitely going to be at the top of the list. Even if you've noticed a small hole or crack that doesn't look big enough for a raccoon to get in, you definitely want to make sure you address it quickly, because they're going to be at it to look for an opportunity to find their way into your home. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to move on to our opossums. I am going to hold off on talking about circumstances with these animals that may require our attention because several of our next usual suspects have similar medical issues that might require professional assistance. So we'll touch on those in just a moment. Now, our next common wild animal that we see quite a few human encounters with in this area are our opossums. These are some of my favorite animals. Actually, I love opossums. They are our only marsupial in North America. And just like raccoons, they are primarily nocturnal. But again, just like with raccoons, they are opportunistic. So they will come out whenever there's food available. They tend to be a little bit more reclusive than raccoons. They really prefer being in wooded areas. So we're not as likely to see them in wide open spaces unless there's a lot of high grass or shrubbery that can provide them with cover. Now, they mainly eat carrion, so they are scavengers and they will eat deceased animals, which is kind of yucky, I suppose, from our end, but they provide a very important environmental function. So they are part of our decomposers in our natural environment, and they break down decaying matter to return nutrients to the environment. They are also known to dine on insects, worms, eggs, amphibians, berries, and fruit. And I know we're having a really terrible tick year right now. Opossums love to eat ticks. So if you see one in your backyard, tell them thank you, because they are going to help keep that tick population low in your immediate neighborhood. Now, potential conflicts with humans are actually quite rare, outside of just perhaps being startled that we have encountered one, especially during the day, because there is that misconception that they should be nocturnal only. But opossums are not aggressive. So I'm sure we've all heard that phrase, playing possum, meaning you just lay down and let the world pass you by. That is their go-to move if they feel frightened. I love skunks, but most people don't feel the same, because with that glorious furry coat comes a very pungent odor. So skunks do have glands in their tail that produce a sulfurous liquid. And they can spray up to about 10 feet successfully once they have reached adulthood. So I do always like to stress that this time of year, you will see a lot of juvenile skunks. They're going to be coming out of their nest areas to explore the world. They don't have an inherent fear of people or dogs. And there will be times, just like with other wild offspring, where mom is not around to watch out for them. So it's very common to see young skunks approach people. They cannot spray yet. So if they feel threatened, they will definitely do the skunk dance, where they kind of jump at you like a kitten. You might hear a little hissing. That tail will tense. They are not capable of spraying just yet. So no cause for alarm. You just want to make a loud noise and startle them and encourage them to scurry away, because we definitely want to encourage that natural healthy fear of humans to avoid negative interactions once they reach adulthood. Now, skunks, just like opossums and raccoons, are typically nocturnal, but just like opossums and raccoons, they are opportunistic feeders. So they are going to come out when the food is available. So seeing skunks in broad daylight is not a cause for alarm. It's perfectly normal, especially if there is an abundant food resource in the area. Now, potential conflicts with skunks are almost always focused on that unpleasant spray that they are capable of. So usually when we get complaints about skunks in an area, it's because someone has had an unpleasant encounter in their own backyard, or their dog has had an unpleasant encounter, or on a walk, they have seen skunks and potentially been sprayed. We also do see issues with skunks getting into garbage, just like with raccoons and opossums. Skunks, though, are less likely as long as we have sturdy trash cans, because skunks cannot climb at all. They are actually quite clumsy. So as long as you don't have a trash can that is light enough for them to knock over, then that's typically not a negative encounter you're likely to have with them. Then our next wild animals that we want to focus on are our wild canines. And in this area, that's going to be coyotes and foxes. Now, both species are highly adaptable. And just like with raccoons, we actually see them in urban, rural, and suburban areas. And they seem to be equally successful across the board. Now, just like with our last few mammals, these guys are considered nocturnal, but just like everyone else, they are opportunistic and they will be active during the day. And we actually find that they tend to be more active during the day in heavily human populated areas, because they've actually adjusted to our schedule. And so when we're active and we might be bringing out food resources, whether that's bringing out the trash or taking a walk and maybe spilling some food on the sidewalk, they're going to be out looking for the fruits of that labor. So we'll see them active more during the day in heavily human populated areas. And while yes, they can be intimidating, we do have to remember that they are essential members of the ecosystem, and we absolutely need them in this area to ensure that our prey animal populations are kept in check, which then in turn allows for our natural foliage to grow successfully. So they do play a very critical role in our environment. Now, potential conflict with coyotes and foxes is almost solely revolving around actual or perceived threats. So we do see occasional small dog attacks, typically from coyotes. And we definitely at DuPage get a fair number of calls with concern over human safety. But we will talk about that a little later on. There have been few, if any, documented cases of foxes attacking humans, and there have actually been a very limited number of actual physical encounters between coyotes and humans as well. So yes, a concern if you have small animals, particularly small dogs, an outdoor cat or a rabbit or chicken that lives outside, but otherwise in terms of human safety, these guys are generally relatively benign. Now, for all of these kiddos, so our raccoons, our opossums, our skunks, our coyotes, and our foxes, they all have very similar issues that they may encounter that require our assistance. So if they are incapacitated, meaning unable to move, they are going to need help. And that can be as a result of being hit by a car. It could be that they are trapped or they perceive themselves to be trapped. Or in some cases, we also may find these animals that are suffering from mange. So you can see here pictured on the slide, this is actually an opossum that received medical care at Willowbrook after being hit by a car. So he is wearing a little splint because he broke his arm. One of our most common perceived to be trapped encounters actually really occurs with skunks most frequently. You can see the skunk here on the bottom of the slide. He actually has a Yoplait yogurt cup stuck on his head. So my PSA for today for skunk health and safety is that if you are a yogurt eater, please make sure that one, the yogurt cups are rinsed thoroughly before you're disposing of them. 2, that your trash and recycling is well secured when outside. And then 3, if you can do our skunks a favor by simply cutting down the one side of that Yoplait cup, that will allow them to pull their heads back out. So this is actually probably one of the most common calls our animal control officers get sent out on, is there is a skunk who got their head into a yogurt cup because yogurt is, well, let's face it, basically sugar, and it smells awesome and they want it. And they get their head in, and because they have those big clumsy feet, they can't pull the cup back off of their head. So they get stuck. They're going to get frightened, upset. They're far more likely to spray, and they can actually starve to death or suffocate with that yogurt cup on their head. So we want to make sure that we do everything we can to prevent that. Now, for all of these animals, we do also see some concern with mange, but in this area, we've seen that most specifically in our coyote population. So you can see this coyote here pictured on the top of the slide has a fairly severe case of mange where almost all of the fur is gone. You see those heavily scabbed ears and paws. That's all a sign of mange. Now, unfortunately, and again, we'll talk about professional resources, there's not a whole lot that most agencies can do, but you would definitely want to contact the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. They like to monitor mange in Illinois, and they are the most likely to be able to offer assistance for that animal if they do appear to be suffering. Now, we do also see a fair number of cases of distemper in DuPage County, particularly in our raccoons and skunks. While foxes and raccoons can definitely contract distemper, we just don't see it very often. So it's definitely something to watch out for, but not a huge concern. Opossums do not seem to be able to carry distemper. They have a much lower internal body temperature that makes it difficult for the virus to incubate. So they typically will not show these symptoms. But if you do encounter a distempered animal, we often get calls with individuals being concerned about rabies in these animals. We haven't had a reported case of rabies in skunks, raccoons, opossums, coyotes, or foxes in northern Illinois in decades. What you're more likely seeing is distemper. So common signs of distemper are actually very similar to those of rabies. You're going to get a lot of discharge from the eyes, and as the disease progresses, that discharge will become thicker, more viscous, and will actually seal the eyes shut. So the animals will be blind and therefore moving erratically, bumping into things. They can't see clearly. They'll have uncoordinated movements, which in the beginning of the disease will just seem like jerky movements as they're walking. So it'll seem like they have a little hitch in their step. It can become fairly pronounced where their legs will seemingly spasm without their knowledge. They can cause them to fall and cause other issues as well. You'll see muscle twitches as the disease progresses, weakness or outright paralysis. And then towards the end stages of the disease, you'll actually see fairly extreme seizures as well. Now, just to give you all an idea of what this looks like, I do have a video. We're only going to show just a few seconds of it because it is very sad. But this is a young raccoon that is in the care, or was in the care, of a wildlife rehabilitation facility that was confirmed to have distemper, and unfortunately was humanely euthanized shortly after this video. But you can see what the distemper looks like. Hopefully this will load. So there you can see a lot of muscle spasms. That's the opening and closing of the jaw, that consistent licking. You can see the twitching of her eyes. All of that is involuntary movement as a direct result of the virus progressing in her system. If this raccoon had been allowed to continue and carry on, she would have experienced seizures and then ultimately would have perished on her own. But they did opt to humanely euthanize her to end her suffering. Now, one of the last animals that we definitely want to discuss are our bats. So when we talk about our furry flyers in Illinois, we see about 13 different species of bat. The most common being the little brown bat, which is what is pictured here on the slide. That is the bat you are most likely to encounter in northern Illinois. They do feast on a variety of bugs, so they are very helpful to us. So we don't want to shoo them away unless we absolutely need to. They eat preferentially moths, June bugs, and then they'll go after other large insects. There is a misconception that bats eat thousands of mosquitoes every evening. And while yes, they will consume mosquitoes, so they are helpful in that way, they're going to preferentially go after larger insects because they're just simply easier for them to catch. They do roost in secluded, warm locations. And that's where we see some difficulties with bat-human encounters. As we have begun to populate more and more of the planet, we've started to take away a lot of their natural roosting sites. So they are starting to roost closer and closer to us. And just like with raccoons, if there's an opening to get into your attic, to get into a crawl space, to get into a garage, they're going to take it and they're going to roost there. Now, the potential conflict that we see with bats is more of a concern for human health and safety because bats are in fact known to carry rabies in this area. So that does not mean that you should be alarmed every time you see a bat, but bats should definitely be captured by a professional and tested for rabies if there has been any direct exposure to either humans or pets. So if you find a bat in your home, even if you can't confirm if it came into physical contact with you, it is a good idea to have it tested for rabies because bats have very, very tiny teeth. So while you were sleeping, it is possible that that bat could have bitten and you wouldn't necessarily notice it or feel it. So if the bat is found in your home, it is a good idea to have it tested for rabies. If there's any known contact between humans and pets, and the bats, then there definitely should be a test. So if your dog has found a bat outside and picked it up, we often see children find bats on sidewalks sometimes and they'll unknowingly scoop it up to try to help. We definitely want to test that bat for rabies then at that point. However, if you just see them outside flying about, if they are roosting in your garage, we can talk about ways to encourage them to find a different place to live. But as long as there's no risk of direct contact, we can just let them be. So those are our most common animals that we receive calls about at DuPage County Animal Services. And I imagine those are the animals that you all are most likely to see in your immediate area. So hopefully that information helps ease any fears and answer questions. But we're going to go ahead and move on to dispelling common myths regarding our wild neighbors. So first and foremost, hands-on is fine. So we definitely get a lot of calls about juvenile mammals and young birds that folks want to help, but they're afraid to touch them because there is this really prevalent myth that if we put our hands on an animal, mom is not going to take care of them anymore. And that is distinctly untrue. So first and foremost, with our mammals, if you do see youngsters out and about, always follow the simple rules that if they have open eyes and they are fully furred, they are probably fine. But if you encounter youngsters that are still largely naked, so they don't have a lot of fur, their eyes are not fully open, they can absolutely be picked up and placed back in their nest. Again, using standard safety precautions. Even though there's little to no risk of transmission of disease, we do always advocate for wearing gloves just to protect yourself, but you don't have to worry about your scent getting on that animal and preventing mom from providing care. That absolutely will not happen. Mom will still attend to her babies. Now, when it comes to baby birds, you can handle those baby birds with even more confidence because birds' sense of smell is worse than ours. So mama birds definitely do not identify their youngsters by smell at all. So they do not mind if you scoop up a baby in need and put it back in the nest. But it is highly likely that if you do see a baby bird on the ground, they will likely not need your help. So you really need to be able to identify your babies to guarantee that you're not offering unsolicited assistance to our animal friends. So if you note this graphic here on the slide, these are some good signs for you to follow about whether or not you should be intervening. So if you found a baby bird and it does not appear to be injured, If it has only just a few feathers, like this individual right here, if you can identify a nest and place it back in, absolutely do so. If it seems injured or you are unable to locate a nest, those are birds that are going to need our assistance. However, if they are about this size here and fully feathered, so you can see the difference between the two, this is still a youngster. They're still going to appear awkward and uncoordinated, but they absolutely should be left alone. So this is called a fledgling, and baby birds, when they're ready to start testing their wings and learn to fly, they hop out of that nest, they hop down that branch, they try to flutter, and most of the time fall straight to the ground. That is okay and expected. Mom is still nearby watching out and will do her best to feed and protect that baby. But this is just normal growing pains for birds. They need to figure out how to fly, and this is how they do so. So if you see a young bird like this, as long as you can approach them and they hop away or make an effort to remove themselves from you, they're just fine. If they stay hunkered down and are unable to move or seemingly unable to move, that is another bird that likely needs professional assistance. Another real common myth, and I've addressed this a couple times already, but I really want to drive it home, is that it is not okay for wild animals to be out during the day. Now, everyone is correct in that assumption that it is not standard. Most wildlife are either nocturnal, meaning that they're most active during the day, or excuse me, during the evening and night, or they are crepuscular, which means that they are most active at dawn and dusk in that sort of twilight phase. However, most of our wildlife, especially those that have adapted so well to living in a densely human populated environment, are opportunistic, which means they are going to be out and about whenever resources are available to them. This can be heavily influenced by human activity, such as garbage days, for example, picnics, barbecues during the summer. That is going to influence wildlife activity. We're also going to see them out and about more during breeding seasons, which for most animals we're kind of hitting the tail end of. They all should be actually actively having and caring for their offspring at this point, but there's still a few that are still breeding. And when they're out looking for dates, they're going to be out pretty much morning, noon, and night. And then, of course, coming out of winter, we tend to see our wild animals more active during the day because they're hungry. So they're out looking for resources because they've been living on bare bones minimum for several months during the winter. Now, I also like to clarify and hopefully alleviate a lot of concerns about rabies. We do get a lot of calls with individuals concerned that there's a rabid animal in their area. Again, it's highly unlikely unless it's a bat. In most cases, you are looking at an animal that has distemper, which is still concerning and needs to be addressed, but there is no risk of transmission of distemper from animals to humans, nor is there a great risk from animals to pets as long as your pets are vaccinated. Now, when we do look at rabies, just like distemper, it is caused by a virus. And just like distemper, it attacks the central nervous system, which is why the symptoms between these two viruses are almost identical. Now, rabies can technically be contracted by all mammals, but it is almost impossible for an opossum to incubate the disease simply because their body temperatures are too low. And we don't often see rabies in prey animals simply because rabies is most commonly transmitted through a bite. And if a prey animal like a rabbit or a chipmunk or a squirrel is bitten by a predator that is rabid, they're likely going to die from the bite and not have the opportunity for that virus to incubate. In our area, it is most prevalent in bats. So that is where we see the concern. And you can actually see here on the slide, these are our 2019 numbers for bats. We obviously don't have 2020 yet, but in DuPage last year, we had 9 bats that tested positive for rabies. And you can see throughout Illinois, we had 53 total that tested positive. So that's where we see our largest concern with this virus. So really the best thing to do is to actively prevent the virus from being in your area and something that you're likely to encounter. So the best way to do that is make sure you're avoiding interactions with wildlife. You want to maintain your home, which will prevent animals from taking up residence, especially in attics, under soffits in the roof. You want to make sure those are well maintained because bats are going to gravitate towards those areas to roost. And anytime we get bats roosting in some of those smaller, more confined spaces, it's more likely for them to transmit the virus back and forth. And then, of course, more likely for it to pose a safety risk for humans. It is important that we vaccinate all of our pets. So all cats and dogs should be kept up to date on their rabies vaccine. And you certainly should seek professional help when you see an animal displaying concerning symptoms. So even if now after this presentation, you know if you see a raccoon stumbling about and falling, it's likely distemper, it's still really important that you call for professional help because we definitely want to address that and ensure that we aren't seeing rabies spreading to other mammals in our area. Now, one of the other myths I really like to dispel is this belief that coyotes are dangerous animals. So attacks on humans from coyotes are extraordinarily rare. So there was actually a 2007 study that sought to find all documented coyote attacks on humans. And throughout history in North America, there have only been 187 reliable reports of a coyote attacking a human. 157 of those reports were exclusively in California, Arizona, and Nevada, and all but just a handful directly involved humans feeding wildlife. So that meant that either humans were directly feeding the coyotes or they were feeding other wildlife, typically prey species like squirrels, for example, and then they intervened when the coyote came into that area. So that's definitely something to consider. If you are seeing not just coyotes, but raccoons and opossums and skunks in your yard and you're not happy with their presence, if you are feeding squirrels or you are feeding birds, you are also either directly feeding those animals or you're feeding the prey animals that are going to draw these animals into your yard. So you want to make sure that we're removing any of those food sources then to encourage these wild animals to move along. Now, there have been calls in this area in the past for eradication of coyote populations, and that is another myth I like to dispel. Eradication does not work. Mass killings of coyotes have been conducted all throughout history, and actually even very recently, several years ago, there was an eradication of coyotes in Wheaton with that sole intent of reducing their population. But what we have found is that mass killing actually only increases the population. So having an eradication done in the area has many unintended consequences. So the way that coyotes work in a stable pack, you can see here in this image, this first set of coyotes is our stable pack. There will be a breeding pair, a male and a female. They often live with non-breeding adult individuals that are most often siblings of that breeding female and male, but only one pair breeds. And because they're sharing resources in that area with their entire pack, those litters are typically small, anywhere from 2 to 4 is all we typically see for coyote offspring. And they will stay relatively small in relationship to the resources that are available. So these packs never really grow terribly large. And having that resident pack in your area of adult mature coyotes that know well enough to stay away from humans by and large will actually reduce the likelihood of transient young coyotes coming into the area. So as coyote pups grow up and they want to strike out on their own, they form small packs of juveniles, sometimes just individuals, sometimes it's 1 or 2, sometimes a few more. They're the ones that typically get themselves into trouble because they don't know any better and they don't know well enough to stay away from people. But if we maintain stable resident packs, they will actually drive those transient coyotes further and further away from human populations. However, if we use an eradication effort and we kill off that stable pack, we're inviting all of those transient, typically younger coyotes to move in. And by killing off that stable pack, we're also allowing our prey species in the area to increase, which means there's more abundant resources. So we've killed off the resident coyotes, transient coyotes come in, they're younger, they've got an abundance of resources now, they're all going to breed. And because the resources are more abundant and these coyotes are younger, they actually have larger litters. So what we have found in areas that have worked with an eradication effort is that maybe for that year, the coyote population is down, but by the next year, it's not only back, but it was larger than it was when we started. So eradication is not the appropriate measure when we're looking to have a more harmonious relationship with our coyote population in our area. So what we want to look at instead is humane conflict resolution. So rather than using lethal means, we want to explore non-lethal options. And our first option for humane conflict resolution is prevention. So I'm sure we've all heard that saying that an ounce of prevention goes a very long way, and that is definitely going to hold true for interactions with wildlife. So there's a lot of things that we can do to make sure we never have negative encounters. So first and foremost, never feed wild animals. And of course, that directly applies to our opossums, our raccoons, our coyotes, our foxes. But really, if you're not happy with having wild neighbors coming onto your property, we need to nix the feeding of all wild animals. And that includes our squirrels and our birds, because they're going to, one, draw more predator attention to your area because there's going to be an abundance of prey animals, but they're also going to be making a mess too. So they're going to be dropping seeds and berries all along the way, which is going to draw more animals, possibly animals you didn't want, into your yard. You want to make sure that all pet food and water dishes are kept inside and secured at all times. So again, we're not drawing in all of these wild animals. A big one for the summertime is making sure we keep our grills and barbecues clean. So we definitely see more wildlife calls right after 4th of July or Memorial Day, even if we want to go back a little bit this year. Anytime that humans have gathered and we've barbecued and we've made all of these awesome meaty smells, if those grills are not cleaned, you're going to have foxes and coyotes, especially moving into that area, because it smells pretty awesome and they want some too. Whenever possible, it's a good idea to keep your garbage cans inside. So secure them in a shed or in a garage to avoid any invitations to raccoons, especially in that case. If you compost, use sealed compost bins, and you want to avoid adding pet waste, meat, milk, or eggs, because those are all scents that as they decompose are going to attract a lot of wildlife. Keep the ground below bird feeders and fruit trees clean. So if you're going to have bird feeders, that's going to require a lot of maintenance. Make sure any drop seeds, berries, etc. get well cleaned up underneath that bird feeder on a daily basis if possible. And if you have fruit trees, like crabapple trees even, you want to make sure that you're cleaning up any debris that falls from that tree, because that especially is going to draw in skunks. So they can't climb to get all of those yummy things, so they wait for it to fall on the ground. And if it's falling on the ground in your yard, that's where they're going to come and hang out for their lunch. If you do have a vegetable garden, make sure you're protecting it with heavy duty fences to avoid, again, that open invitation of a buffet to all of our wild neighbors. And you want to use welded wire to block access to areas under decks, sheds, patios, and porches. So you can see these foxes here are hanging out underneath somebody's shed. So anytime we have these open spaces that you see pictured here, that is just an invitation for a wild animal to move in. So you want to eliminate those options as much as you possibly can. If you have a chimney, installing and maintaining chimney caps is a great idea. This doesn't apply to many of the wild animals that we have addressed in this presentation, although bats have been known to go down chimneys. But we do see a fair number of calls regarding birds stuck in chimneys, sometimes the occasional squirrel as well. So just by placing a chimney cap on the top of your chimney, that can prevent a lot of those potential conflicts. If you have any rotten or broken areas in your roof or soffit, it's really important that that is addressed immediately. Again, those are areas that raccoons and bats in particular are really going to look for to find a way to get into your house where they can find a really nice warm roosting or nesting location. And if you have any overgrown bushes or dense weeds in your yard or in an immediate surrounding area, it's a good idea to keep that as cleared as possible. That provides a great hiding spot for some of our predators. So that's going to attract a lot of foxes and coyotes. And that can also attract some animals like deer, for example, that are looking for a nice daycare spot for their fawns. So if you don't want that in your area, you want to make sure all of those weeds are cut down and low. Now, if you have done your due diligence and you've tried your hardest to make your yard and home as unappealing to wild animals as possible, but you still have uninvited guests, there are gentle ways that we can ask wildlife to move along. So ammonia-soaked rags can work wonders. So if you have a skunk, for example, that's decided that under your porch looks like a pretty nice place to take a nap every day, soaking rags with ammonia and placing them in that area can be a very useful deterrent. Now, I have had a lot of folks tell me that they tried it and it didn't work, but that's because the rags were not being replaced rapidly enough. So anytime we use gentle aversives to ask a wild animal to move along, it's never going to be a one and done situation, because that animal has already decided that that spot under your deck or your porch or somewhere in your backyard is a pretty cool place to be. So we have to work a little harder to convince them that it's not. So if you are going the ammonia soaked rag route, it needs to be replaced at least once a week, if not more frequently. So if you really want them to scooch along, resoaking a rag and replacing it every 2 to 3 days is actually most effective. You can also use deterrents such as sirens or motion activated lights or sprinklers. So that's something that I actually do in my yard. I have motion activated floodlights, and I actually do that more for wildlife safety than anything else, because I have 3 big dogs. So I want wild animals to know that my yard is not a safe place to hang out. So if we get the occasional raccoon, for example, that totters across my yard, it actually activates my floodlights. And when that happens, I see those animals scurrying over my fence as quickly as possible. And we don't often see them come back around. So one good solid scare is usually enough to deter most animals. You can also use urine-soaked kitty litter. So if you've identified a den or a nest, you can sprinkle that around that area. You can also sprinkle it as a perimeter around your yard. Now, I have had people ask me what sort of urine. So cat urine is good if you've got one. Otherwise, if you've got a brave human soul in your household, you can use human urine as well. You're looking for predator urine, basically, and that's going to help deter animals from your area. It's also really effective if you've got a garden that rabbits will just not leave alone, and you've got a cat. Put that cat box to good use and sprinkle that urine-soaked litter all around the outskirts of that garden. That's a pretty strong get lost sign to most prey animals. Constant light and repetitive noise in or near a den can be very useful. So if you don't want to install floodlights, even if you just have one light that you shine directly at a den area, that's very effective. Or if you have the capability of hooking up radio, just blast a radio out there as much as you can tolerate for a day or two, and you're likely going to see those animals move along. You can also use hazing, which we will talk about specifically here in just a moment. But basically what we're going to be doing is making ourselves seem big, scary, and threatening to any wild animals that come into our area. And we're going to do that consistently every time we see them, so they know that we are really not cool to hang out with, and they're going to find somewhere else to be. Now, we do ask, if you are using gentle aversives, to try to avoid using them March through August, particularly if we are using the ammonia-soaked rags, because during this time frame, we're seeing a lot of wild animals creating dens and nests, and it's likely if you're placing those ammonia-soaked rags there, you're actually trapping young animals in that den, and they're too young to escape from that odor, and it can actually be deadly to them. Oops, sorry, excuse me. So we want to make sure that if you're seeing denning animals, you're starting to see skunks and possums, maybe raccoons hanging around, you want to note where they're hanging out earlier in the year. So January, February, March, that's when they're breeding. That's when they're looking for a new place to safely have their offspring and care for them while they are dependent on mom and dad. So you want to get them and make your yard unappealing to them before they have offspring. Once they have offspring, we usually have to look for alternative routes to move them if they are posing a problem in your area. Now, hazing is probably one of our most effective ways to ask wildlife to move along. It's something that we particularly suggest for coyotes. So I'm going to use them as an example, but it really is effective for any wild animal. So if you see a coyote, or insert other wild animal in here for an example, you want to be as big and as bold as possible. So yell and wave arms while approaching the coyote, just like you see this gentleman here in the picture. There's actually a coyote right there. He's a bit blurry, that is skedaddling out of that area as quickly as he can. You can definitely use noisemakers. So it can be your voice, but you can also use bells, whistles, or air horns. When I used to live in Batavia, I actually had a small Jack Russell that I would hike with quite a bit in the forest preserves. And there were a lot of coyotes out there. And of course, a Jack Russell looks like a tasty morsel. So I got in the habit of actually carrying a really small pocket-sized air horn. And if we saw them, I would just blast that once, and then I would never see a coyote again for the whole rest of the time we were on a hike. So loud noises, abrasive noises can be very effective. You can also use projectiles. Now, of course, we don't want to throw anything directly at the animal because we don't want to injure them, because if they're perceiving us as that immediate of a threat, we might have an adverse reaction. But you want to throw things in the general direction of them, especially if you have a good enough arm to get it right in front of that animal. So their only option is to turn away from you and go in the opposite direction. So sticks, small rocks, anything of that nature is certainly going to be effective. And you can also try other repellents. So water guns or spray bottles are really effective. And if you're having a problem in your yard specifically, if you can have one on hand that you've mixed water with vinegar, that is extra aversive to these animals and is a sure way to drive them off. Also, if you're in your yard and you've got a hose available, if you want to turn the hose on these animals, that's usually a very clear sign to them that they are not welcome in this area. And that's not an experience that they're likely to want to repeat. So they will often try to avoid that space. Now, big things when we talk about hazing is, first and foremost, we want to make sure we are never running. So if you see a coyote, don't ever run, because that is actually going to basically invite that coyote more into your space. And you also want to continue hazing until effective. So anybody that has a pet in your home, just like if you've got a dog and you're working on teaching them a sit behavior, you can't teach it just once and expect them to get it 100% of the time thereafter. You have to be consistent and repetitive. This is the same thing with hazing. We are training our wild animals, so we have to be consistent and repetitive. Every time we see this animal, they're going to get the same treatment: big, bold, yelling, arm waving, tall posture, projectiles thrown at them, the hose turned on them. Every time they see a person, something bad happens. So they'll learn to steer clear. Now, if you attempt hazing and the animal is non-responsive, it is likely that it is sick or injured. So in that point, I would give you the caveat that we do not want to approach. So do not continue hazing if that animal is completely non-responsive. That's when you're going to want to call in professional help, because something is going on with that animal that needs to be addressed. Now, when we are working with wild animals and dealing with them in our living spaces, we definitely want to make sure that we're keeping our pets safe. So while coyotes and foxes don't really pose a threat to us, they may pose a threat to our pets. So it's very important that we keep a watchful eye on our animals, particularly our small dogs, which we often are going to be letting outside in the evening when we're going to see these crepuscular animals most active. So we should always be monitoring our dogs when outdoors. Again, I am a big fan of installing floodlights. Make sure you turn those on before the dog goes outside. I also, before I let my pets outside for an evening potty, I knock on the door fairly loudly to alert any wildlife that might be in that backyard that dogs are coming, and to give them an opportunity to startle away. You should always be out in the yard with your pet. If you know there are coyotes in the area, again, especially if you have a small dog, it's a good idea to keep them on leash and keep them within 6 feet of you. A coyote is not going to come into that close of proximity to you to get that animal. It's not worth it at that point. So that's a good way to keep them safe. Always be extra mindful at dawn and dusk, because these predators are largely crepuscular. So we know they're most active and most likely actively hunting during those time periods. Now, if you have small animals, they should be kept indoors or in secure buildings. So We always advocate that cats, rabbits, and others should always be indoor only pets. And in fact, DuPage County in regards to cats has an ordinance that states that they must be. But you want to really make sure that you're doing your best to protect your pets. Rabbit hutches are difficult, if not impossible, to predator proof. I've seen people put some really solid efforts into making a rabbit hutch for the rabbit to be outdoors and keep them safe. And inevitably, at some point in time, a raccoon gets in there, a coyote gets in there, or a fox gets in there. So it's a good idea to just keep all small animals inside. Cats, again, should be indoors only. And if you do have chickens, they should be enclosed in a coop at night. So you want to make sure it's as secure as possible. Now, things to consider when we're looking at our wild animal interactions and resolutions to our problems. Keep in mind that trapping and removing an animal is not always the correct solution. Removing an animal is illegal without proper permits, so you definitely want to make sure that you're not illegally trapping. Only licensed wildlife trappers have the legal right to trap wildlife in Illinois. So just be mindful of that. And you also want to consider, just like with that eradication of coyotes, if you trap one raccoon and move it away without identifying what was drawing the raccoon into that area, you're just creating an open space for another animal to move in. And of course, we might note that if we trap adults and move them, that we might be leaving young behind to die of starvation. So the main goal should always be on focus on removing the attraction and not the animal itself. So you want to identify what's appealing to the animal and see if you can reduce that appeal. Never move young from a den if it can be avoided. Most young animals, just like with baby bunnies, do not do well, even if we are trying to save them and take them to a wildlife rehabilitator. They don't do well without mom present. So their survival rate severely decreases once they're removed from their den. We always advocate to never use poisons. There is no such thing as a humane poison. They all cause an immense amount of pain. Some are illegal, and they can also result in secondary poisoning of other wild animals or pets. So we see issues, especially with large birds of prey, for example, that are picking off mice and chipmunks, things like that, that may have eaten poison. That poison accumulates in our large birds, and we have a lot of unintended victims. We do see it from time to time with dogs as well, that are snagging animals outdoors. They suffer from secondary poisoning. And then, of course, I always have to remind everybody that it is illegal to keep wild animals, even for a short time. So they do have special nutritional, housing, and handling needs. And even if we're well-intentioned, inexperienced individuals can create unhealthy or tame animals that then can't be reintroduced to the wild. So if you do encounter an animal that needs help, you definitely want to make sure that you're leaving that to professionals. So really quickly, I know I'm a bit over my time already, so I apologize for that. I'll go through some of the resources that you have if you do need to reach out for professional assistance. So first, of course, DuPage County Animal Services may be a resource for you. We are able to respond to sick and injured wildlife calls, but only in unincorporated DuPage County. So just like police departments have their own jurisdiction, so do we. So we can only assist in unincorporated DuPage. For us to assist, the animals must be either physically contained or otherwise immobilized or trapped. We do not have the capabilities to set traps. So if the animal is able to get up and flee from us, there isn't a whole lot, unfortunately, that we can do for them. We can also assist if a wild animal has gotten into the living quarters of your home. So that does not apply to unfinished basements, cellars, or attics. But if you do have a raccoon in your living room, for example, in unincorporated DuPage, we can assist with that. Now, we are unable to respond to any calls within incorporated DuPage County, so we'll talk about resources for that here in just a moment. We also don't respond to nuisance wildlife, so we aren't going to come out and eradicate a possum that's digging up your garden, for example. We'll ask you to use gentle but humane aversives to deter them from your area in those cases. And again, any animals that appear sick or injured but are able to flee, unfortunately, there's just not a whole lot that we can do for them. And usually the general rule of thumb is that if they are healthy enough to actively try to get away from humans, usually their best bet is to let them stay in the wild they're either going to recover, they may perish, but that is the natural cycle of things. Most of those animals just experience a great deal of stress when moved to a wildlife rehabilitator, and don't tend to thrive in those circumstances anyways. Now, if you do live in incorporated DuPage and you have a wildlife concern, your first go-to should be your police department. Now, every police department does vary in their policies. So they make their own decisions regarding wildlife within their jurisdictions. So they do get to choose when and where they will respond. Some departments do have trained animal control officers on staff or community service officers that are prepared to handle wildlife concerns. But all are likely going to be limited in their response capabilities based on other calls or circumstances that are going on in that area. So of course, they're always going to prioritize human safety first over a wild animal's welfare. Now, if you have a larger concern, you can always reach out to the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. You should definitely contact IDNR if you witness anybody illegally trapping wildlife. They will send out an officer to reprimand and potentially ticket that individual. If you've observed a coyote with mange, IDNR does like to hear about that. If you find multiple deceased animals, you should definitely report to IDNR. That's often an example of illegal poisoning. And if you have sighted a gray wolf, cougar, or black bear, which hopefully will be very unlikely for you, but we are starting to see them moving back into Illinois, which is a great thing. We do want to see them here, but we want to make sure that we are facilitating safe human wildlife encounters. So we definitely want to make sure that we're alerting everyone in our area if these animals are present, and IDNR will definitely take care of that. Now, if you have found an injured wild animal, you can also take them to Willowbrook Wildlife Center. So they take in wildlife that are sick or injured, and they rehab and release whenever possible. So they are licensed wildlife rehabilitators. This is part of their facility here pictured on this slide. And their goal is always to heal and release. Now, when that is not possible, they are able to provide long-term or permanent care. So the pens that you're seeing pictured here on the slide actually house resident animals that were too injured to be returned to the wild, and they're actually used for educational purposes and very well maintained at the center. Now, Willowbrook does have limitations. They can only accept native wildlife. So they cannot accept anything that is an invasive species. They do not have funding to do that. They also do not accept deer because of their re-release policies. In this area, we have issues with deer overpopulation. So Willowbrook then does not have the licensing to rehabilitate deer because we do want to see some of them perish from natural causes in the wild to make sure that the population doesn't explode. Now, animals do have to be dropped off at the center. They do not have the capability of coming to pick them up. And of course, Willowbrook does have a limitation in regards to capacity. So actually right now, they are at capacity, or they were at least a week ago. I haven't double checked with them, but they were not able to take in any more animals. So they have been flooded with animal calls and concerns, largely because more people are at home. So we're noticing more things. So they've gotten in more animals as a result. Now, if Willowbrook is full, but you have found a wild animal that needs assistance, the Department of Natural Resources actually does maintain a list of additional wildlife rehabilitators. They may not be as conveniently located, but there are several in the area. There is another out in Kane County in Elburn. So that's not too far of a drive if you are living in DuPage County and you do have a wild animal that needs help. We also see other resources offered from the Humane Society of the United States. Again, they keep a pretty comprehensive list of licensed wildlife rehabilitators, and they can also offer a lot of advice and additional resources to creating an unappealing environment in our own yards and around our homes if we don't want wild animal visitors. Now, if you do need to have an animal trapped and removed from your property, you will need to hire a private wildlife trapper. They do trap and remove animals, but these animals are euthanized. So in Illinois, they do not have the proper licensing to rehabilitate and then re-release. So it is actually illegal to transport wild animals from one location to another unless you are a wildlife rehabilitator. So any animal trapped by a private wildlife trapper will be euthanized. But if that is your last available option, there are an abundance of trappers in DuPage County, and they can all be found with a quick Google search. You can also check out the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and there's a great website called wildlifeillinois.org that can help you in finding a trapper in your area. Now, if you do utilize a trapper, you do want to make sure that they are providing quality work. So you want to ask a lot of questions. So the wildlife removal specialist should be able to identify the specific animal that's using whatever structure you see has been infiltrated. So if you've seen droppings or you've noticed a hole that's been opened up or chewed in a wall, for example, but you haven't seen the animal, the wildlife removal specialist will be able to identify type. They'll also be able to pinpoint existing entry points and potential entry points. So they can help you really assess your home and identify any areas that require upkeep or repair. They'll also be able to identify whether or not there are offspring in the area, and they'll be able to walk you through their process of how they determine the answers that they provided. Now, all wildlife trappers should be providing you documentation that guarantees they are licensed and insured. And they should also demonstrate a knowledge of local, state, and federal laws and be able to provide you with documentation of how they remain in compliance with those laws. Always ask for a written estimate first before hiring, and make sure that you understand clearly their policies on removal and guarantees of eviction. So you want to make sure that that wildlife trapper is not just stopping with one animal if they know there's a family in the attic, for example. You want to make sure that they're able to address all of the issue. So thank you for sticking with me. I know I ran over, I apologize, but I would be happy to take any questions now if any have popped up. So let me see here. Oh, I do see in the chat function, there is a question of how many times a day can a skunk spray? Is there a limit to the spray liquid? And do they have a period of time where they have to rest before they spray again? So that's an excellent question. At some point, yes, skunks would simply run out of fluid in their glands, but not quickly. So skunks can definitely spray repeatedly. So if, for example, a dog got too close to a skunk and wasn't taking their back off signals clearly, a skunk can spray and then can spray again if the dog continues to come. Usually they try to use spray once, and they'll try to then take that moment where their foe is sort of stunned and dealing with that stinkiness to flee and get out of that area. But if they maintain the perception of being trapped or are actually physically trapped, they can continue to spray. There isn't going to be really a feasible point where they're not going to be able to spray, say, your dog or yourself if you encounter them. So let's see, I heard that foxes don't see dogs as prey, even small dogs. Is it common to have foxes attack small dogs? No, not at all. So when I did talk about protecting our small dogs, that is going to be coyote based exclusively. Foxes may go after cats, maybe if they're outside, and perhaps for our teeniest, tiniest dogs, they might pose a threat. But the general rule of thumb for any predator is they're really going to only hunt animals smaller than them. And your average fox is not that large. So we're talking about maybe 10 to 15 pounds maximum. And so most dogs are at least that big. But if you have a tiny teacup chihuahua, for example, while I don't think it would be highly likely for a fox to attack, you would definitely want to be a bit more mindful. But generally speaking, foxes are going to take the flight option if they encounter dogs rather than choosing fight. And for them, their ideal prey species are more in line with chipmunks, juvenile rabbits, things like that. Oh, is it true that our coyotes are part wolf? So it is possible. There are hybrids called coy wolves. And we also can see coyotes interbreed with dogs. So we do have, there have been coy dogs as well. So wolves, coyotes, and dogs are all pretty much genetically identical with a few caveats to that. So they are all able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So even though technically we do call them different species, by the biological species definition, they are one and the same because they can breed and produce fertile offspring. In this area, we haven't seen any that have been noted or documented that we believe to be either coy dogs or coy wolves, but it is possible. I have not heard of one. We work very closely with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and there hasn't been any that have been documented in this area, but it is definitely something that could potentially occur. So do we have any additional questions? I'll give it just a minute here if anyone has anything else they would like to ask. Otherwise, I do always like to share my email address. I forgot to put it on the slide this time, but I'm happy to answer any questions if they were to come up tomorrow or a week from today or anytime in the future. Feel free to email me. I can be reached at humane.education@dupageco.org. And again, I am always happy and available to answer any and all questions that may pop up in the future as well. So never hesitate to reach out to me.